Well, but there's 15,000 or 20,000 megawatts in the connection queue. How's the grid going to support those 20,000 megawatts? Well, in my experience, those 20,000 megawatts don't ever all actually come to fruition.
Welcome to Under Review, powered by Ultimarii, the interview series where we unpack the decisions that shape what gets permitted and what gets delayed across North America. Each episode, we sit down with regulators, subject matter experts, practitioners, and project leaders to break down the rules, the realities, and the playbook for getting critical infrastructure approved.
My name is Shaheer Tariq. I am Principal Consultant at Ultimarii, and I am your host today. And I am joined by and very excited to introduce our guest, Miranda Keating Erickson. Welcome, Miranda.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Miranda has a very deep and rich history in the electricity sector. Miranda Keating Erickson retired in 2022 after more than 25 years in the electricity sector, primarily with TransAlta and the Alberta Electric System Operator. As a senior executive at the AESO, she was accountable for, at varying times, operations, regulatory, external affairs, and market design, including forecasting and commercial procurement. In her semi-retirement, she serves as a board director with a continued focus on highly regulated industries. She is a director and chair of the Human Resources Committee at Via Rail and a director of Calgary Co-op. She also continues to give back, currently serving as the advisory board chair to the Global Youth Association, AESO, which I was a part of as a university student, and that is how we met.
It's all a small world.
Well, Miranda, thanks for joining us. I'm interested to hear, I've heard people say that the electricity sector industry is the most complex in the world. Is that what you dreamed about working in when you were growing up?
No, was the short answer. I ended up in the electricity sector by fluke. So I grew up in Montreal. I did a business degree at McGill, focused in marketing and finance, and was living in Europe through AESO, and then came back to Canada and landed in Calgary. And I was trying to figure out sort of a path and decided that investor relations was something that was going to use my career really effectively, or my education really effectively. And there was a job posting at one point in time at TransAlta in their investor relations department. And so that is how I found my way really into the industry, was because of a specific role I wanted to do, not because of the industry I wanted to work in. And then I learned that it's an incredibly fascinating industry, and they kept giving me the opportunity to learn new things and do new things. And so 25 years later, I was still sticking around.
Interesting. And at some point, you switched over from the IPP to the system operator. For the people that don't know, what is the system operator? What is the Alberta Electric System Operator? And what role does this organization play?
So I often use the analogy, and I think I have when you and I have spoken before, of the AESO being like an orchestra conductor. So in most of Canada, when people think about electricity, they think about their big crown utilities, BC Hydro, Manitoba Hydro, Hydro-Quebec. But in Alberta, we have a competitive system with multiple companies providing the different aspects of the electricity system. And so the AESO is essentially the coordinator of all of that. So it's an arm's length agency created by statute, created by the government, to make sure that it all works together in coordination. So like an orchestra conductor, the AESO doesn't play an instrument, it doesn't own any instruments, but it's making sure that whatever the instruments are that everyone brings to the table, they all work together to make a reliable, functioning electricity system. And if I was to outline specifically what the AESO does, so it's got four primary functions. It's responsible for the long-term planning of the transmission grid, to make sure that we have a sufficient transmission grid to support our needs. It's responsible for connecting customers to that grid, so large generators and large consumers of electricity like industrial plants that would connect directly to the transmission system. It is responsible for designing our electricity market in Alberta, and it's responsible for operating both the grid and that electricity market in real time.
Miranda, why is now such an interesting time for the grid? It feels like everybody's always talking about the grid and how we don't have enough capacity, or even if we want to get projects built, the grid is the bottleneck, and it seems like there's just a bit to unpack there. Can you tell us what maybe is different in this era when it comes to the grid?
This is an era of an incredible amount of change. I would call it quite transformational. So for a really long time, the grid in this province was all quite sort of predictable. It had big power plants that had all been built, from the 50s through to the 80s. Its industries were very predictable. Who was using power, the shape of that demand curve for power, the output of those generating plants. It was all really quite predictable. And we're now in a period where it's changing, and it's changing on both sides of the equation at the same time. So there's a transformation in terms of what's producing our electricity. We've phased out coal plants in the province. We have, Alberta had the first ever wind farm in Canada, but we now have an incredible amount of wind generation on the system. We have an ever-growing amount of solar generation on the system. The coal plants have sort of been replaced by natural gas-fired plants, whether that's cogeneration or combined cycle or simple cycle. There's lots of natural gas-fired generation, and the introduction of things like batteries and different forms of energy storage. So what's supplying the electricity is changing quite dramatically and acts quite differently than it did before. At the same time, as the world moves to decarbonize, and Alberta's no different, there's a lot of electrification happening. And so we're using more electricity. Think transportation, think electric vehicles, think as large industries try to reduce their carbon footprint, they're moving to more use of electricity instead of fossil fuels. And so in reality, what ends up happening is it all becomes more complex, less predictable, because we aren't used to it yet. The transformation is still underway. And so it's really, I would say, an unprecedented amount of change on our electricity system compared to any other time since it was created.
Yeah, it sounds like there's the supply side and the demand side, and both of those are undergoing generational transformations. I think we touched on it a little bit earlier, but it sounded like you said the AESO is the primary responsibility of the electric system operator's reliability. Could you tell us a little bit about why these changes in supply and demand impact or make it more difficult to make the grid more reliable, and maybe also some of these new technologies like batteries that can be both supply or demand, how those influence how challenging it can be to keep the grid reliable?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think there's a few things. So one is, again, sort of increased demand for electricity, and so you need increased supply of electricity to keep up with increasing demand. But the electricity grid is sort of a very complex, sophisticated, massive machine, right? It all works together. You have to, so one of the things that, sort of average person thinking about the electricity grid doesn't think about is the amount of power that is being consumed from the grid and the amount of power being supplied onto the grid must be in perfect balance at all times. And if it's not, you can't maintain stable frequency. And if you can't maintain stable frequency, that has all kinds of impacts on our digital economy. And so it's really important to maintain stable frequency. The more conventional grid of 20 years ago had a lot of inherent attributes in it that help to maintain that stability. While the Alberta Electric System Operator, the AESO, while they're balancing, they're dispatching generation to meet load needs, that load, as I said, was sort of more predictable. But now, like even if you look at my house, I have solar panels on the roof of my house. So where my electricity consumption patterns would have looked very predictable day after day after day after day before, now they don't, because sometimes I'm not consuming electricity from my supplier because it's being produced by my solar panels, right? So it just becomes a little bit less predictable. And then when you look at newer types of resources, the renewable resources, because they do depend to some degree on the weather, on how windy it is, on how sunny it is, on whether the solar panels are covered in snow, a lot of those kinds of things, they also are just somewhat less predictable. And so the consumption's a little less predictable and the supply is a little bit less predictable. And conventional spinning turbines, like in a coal plant, would have provided some inertial frequency response that would have bought the system operator time in terms of managing frequency deviations when things happen on the grid. And inverter-based resources, which solar and wind facilities are, don't have that inherent support. And so the Alberta Electric System Operator has to think about, okay, well, how do we get the things we need to help keep this grid reliable and resilient when we don't just naturally get them because they were always there before, right? So how do you go out and make sure that you're going to have enough frequency responsiveness embedded in your system so that you can withstand a power line being knocked out, or you can withstand a generator tripping off.
And any thoughts on how all of that, or how batteries play into all of that?
Batteries are really interesting because they bring all kinds of energy storage, bring some really unique things to the grid. Batteries in particular move really fast, and so they're something that can provide that frequency response that turbines used to provide. They're very dynamic. They can respond to things quickly. They can provide a lot of support from a reliability perspective. A lot of these sort of what we call ancillary services, right? Extra things be outside of just the energy itself. But what batteries can't do is do that for really, really long periods of time, right? They have to charge and after they discharge. And so other types of energy storage provide other kinds of benefits that maybe you don't get from batteries in terms of support, for example, during an extended cold spell in the winter or an extended heat wave in the summer. And so energy storage is a really interesting addition to the grid that brings a lot of benefit. But it also brings complexity because our entire system, all the rules and regulations and the physical system was all designed under the assumption that everything was either a producer or a consumer. And so when you bring something in that's both, you have to rethink your whole rule book to make sure that everything still fits together. So it's just, again, it's more complexity.
Yeah, it's taking the thing that's already the most complex, one of the most complex things in the world, making it more complex. Yeah, and it seems like, again, going back to the end goal is reliability. And that's what the operator is trying to do. The AESO is not a regulator, it's an operator. And with that in mind, as you think back to your time at the AESO, can you think of is there any story that comes to mind where us mortals that are not trying to operate the grid, we don't know that it's a near miss or something where it's something you think back to where it was kind of an important moment for the AESO, but the rest of us that aren't in the control room, so to speak, would have no idea that there was some big event happening as it related to the grid.
The one that would probably resonate the most with people, the electricity system connection between Fort McMurray and effectively the rest of the province, because it's the biggest center that's that far north. There was essentially one transmission line that connected Fort McMurray to the rest of the system. And the challenge that we were faced with was we were working very closely with ATCO because ATCO's the distribution company in the and the transmission company up in that area of the province. And we were trying to maintain electricity service to the Fort McMurray area to support the emergency services. But the fire was rapidly approaching that single transmission line. And the issue there is if you have that line heavily loaded with a lot of power moving from the rest of the province up to Fort McMurray, if the fire takes that line out, that would create an imbalance in the system and create a risk of cascading outages. So you wouldn't just lose the Fort McMurray area, you could have cascading outages through the whole province from losing that line. And so we were working really hard to try to keep that line minimally loaded, but still connected to provide support, but calling on the behind the fence generation at all the oil sands operators to be able to supply the Fort McMurray area locally and not be dependent on shipping power in on that line.
Yeah, and I can imagine that every year, minus 40 or at
Yes.
the or even I guess at the height of summer when we had like really crazy heat waves, which with AC draw and stuff like that.
Yeah, typically the most stressful times on the grid are during extreme weather. So in really, really cold weather, typically in Alberta, that means we don't have a lot of wind. The colder it gets, the less windy it gets. And often it also means that solar, first of all, it's usually short days, and solar panels are often covered by frost and ice. And the draw, the demand for electricity is very high in very cold weather. So that's always tricky. And in recent years, heat waves have become, I would say, even trickier. So for two reasons. One is you're right, there's way more air conditioning load than there ever was before. Second, again, patterns of weather in Alberta. When we have heat waves, typically we don't have wind. The good news is we do typically have sun, and lots of it. And then the other piece is natural gas-fired plants typically are impacted by the heat, and in order to keep them from overheating, they have to output a little bit less. And so there's a whole bunch of things that can factor in during extreme weather on either end of the spectrum.
Yeah, and as I hear more about this, it seems like maybe the thing that people don't appreciate about the grid and some of these things is that it's as much an engineering problem as it is, if not more, an engineering problem than anything else. And beyond that, I think the thing that I'm starting to appreciate a bit more is that it's also an economics problem. Because the thing that you mentioned earlier is one of the roles of the AESO is market design, right? And I know this is a big question on everyone's mind right now, very topical, is the restructuring electricity market, right? And so, before getting into that and talking about where that's coming from or where the need is arising out of, I'd like to take a step back and just at a higher level, could you just explain to us, if you were designing an electricity market from scratch for any jurisdiction, right? What are the different levers at your disposal? How would you go about designing an electricity market?
I think it's important to think about, ultimately, an electricity market, any market, is all about price signals. In a world like I referenced earlier, jurisdictions that don't have open markets, that have crown utilities, so a BC Hydro, a SAS Power, they sort of get to centrally plan and operate everything and do things in the most economic way possible, but with sort of full ownership of the whole piece. When you have an electricity market, you're counting on the market signals, the pricing signals, to incent the behaviors that you want to have both a reliable and an economically efficient system. And you're right, yes, it's an engineering problem, but the engineering is actually the simpler part of the equation. The economics of designing a market can get very complex. I'm a big believer in simplicity, but oftentimes there's a lot of sort of over-engineering of those pricing signals to try to get to the best outcome. And so what you're looking at is, what things are we going to price? Like, what you're trying to do is you're incenting consumers to make decisions about when they consume. And so you want them to consume less when there's stress on the system and consume more when there's lots available. And you want producers to produce more when consumers are demanding more, and to produce less when consumers are demanding less. And so you need to be sending the right price signals. And then the question is, what else do you need, and what else do you attach a price to? So for a really long time in Alberta, we had what we called an energy-only market, which is the simplest type of electricity market design there is. If you're a generator, when you produce, you get paid, and when you don't produce, you don't get paid. When you're trying to maintain a reliable system and you need to make sure that you're keeping everything in balance and that you've got frequency responsiveness baked into the system so that you can withstand contingencies, events on the system, then you have to think about, do we need to pay people for that? And if so, how do we price that to make sure we get it when we need it? And we get the right amount of it, and we're not paying too much for it, because ultimately consumers pay for all of this. And so how do you do things in a way that's the most economically efficient, therefore results in both a reliable system, but also an affordable system?
Yeah, reliability, affordability, and I guess even fairness, right? In terms of how do you allocate, and so how do you think about, even what levers are at your disposal for tariff design?
I think of it as competition, right? So yes, there's both fairness and competition. If I was to put my AESO hat back on, when you're thinking about market design, you're thinking about who's consuming out of the market and who's producing and selling in the market, and how do you, for the consumers, how do you make sure that it's fair, that everybody has equal access to the system? For the producers, how do you ensure that it's fair and they all have equal access to the system, but also that competition is open, right? So there aren't barriers to entry for someone to come and add a generator to the system. You want everybody to be able to come and compete, because that's how you get to, the more competition there is in a market, the better the price, ultimately. On the tariff side of the equation, you're typically thinking about, how do we recover the costs of the transmission system that underpins that market and enables it to work and enables that electricity to get delivered from who's producing it to who's consuming it. And again, fairness is important. How do you allocate the costs of that system in a way that reflects how that system's being used? And so those that put more demand or more strain on the system pay more for the system. The complexities, I would argue, tariff design is even more complex than market design is, because you have to think about every possibility and every type of consumer and every user of the system, and what's the best way to send the right price signal to them.
Yeah, and I think you've said to me before that in all of this, you have to build for the extremes. So you can't, it's not like there's an average sort of grid design that works. It has to be robust to the, like we said earlier, the extreme weather events or whatever other set of permutations might cause new generation to go offline or consumption to increase.
Frequently gets accused of having a bias towards reliability. I would suggest there is a bit of a bias, and the reason for that is because the risk is not symmetrical. The risk of an extreme weather event, the impact on our provincial economy of losing the electricity system is not bearable. Like, that's an unacceptable risk. And so you have to build your electricity grid to be able to withstand all of those things. We refer to them as contingencies. Something that causes a transmission line to go out of service, a generator to go offline, a large load to act in a way that couldn't have been predicted and create an imbalance on the system. Lengthy periods of not being able to access certain parts of the system because of a flood or because of a fire. Because if you don't, then that puts literally your entire provincial economy at risk. And so you do have to build an electricity system, right? So the grid is only a part of it. Your electricity system broadly has to be able to withstand all of those things. So we describe it as being not just reliable, but resilient, that you can keep it online even when these things are happening. And when something does go offline, that you can get it back as quickly as possible, that you can recover from whatever the event is as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I guess it all comes down to reliability, because society relies found at a very fundamental level
More and more and more.
on electricity.
Yeah.
and we all take for granted that things would go very bad very quick if the grid went offline. And so that's the fundamental, well, I use the term bias, I guess that's the fundamental imperative. But on that term bias, I mean, I'd be curious to understand, from your time at the ISO, what is something that comes to mind where, whether it's in the consultation, when you talk to project developers or communities or whichever stakeholder it may be, that if you could talk to them and say, or from their point of view, always felt like you were being unfair or you weren't prioritizing their concerns or whatever, concern they might have had, where from your point of view, you'd love to be able to explain to them what it was like from behind the curtain. What comes to mind with something that they might have thought was biased, but to you was just what you had to do to make things work?
Industry wants to build something and wants to connect it to the grid. And that could be they want to build a factory or a data center, or that could be, they want to build a power plant. And trying to understand why it takes so long for the ISO to study all of the permutations of what impact adding that to the grid could have, and making sure that the grid can withstand the characteristics that thing is now going to bring to the grid. Because once it's all plugged in together, it's all one big machine, right? So I think it certainly happens there around the engineering and the timelines and the requirements that the ISO puts on industry when they're connecting to the grid. It definitely happens in terms of market rules. And when rules are put in place that are specifically to address a reliability need, but it may impose cost on a generator, if we put a requirement on them to be able to do something, to add something to their plant, to be able to manage something, that's not fair that you're requiring us to spend money. But if it's a reliability imperative for the whole system to be able to work.
Yeah, I think those are really good examples, kind of related to what we're talking about. But you said earlier, price signals are very important in market design. And, as we look at the restructuring electricity market in Alberta, one of the areas or one of the ideas that I've heard subject to a lot of discussion is LMP. Could you explain what does that even stand for? What is LMP? And also, what are some of the maybe pros and cons of LMP as an approach?
LMP stands for locational marginal price. Where the change is in Alberta, our electricity market, our energy market has always had a single price. So all energy being produced and sold onto the grid gets paid the same price in any given hour, and everyone who's consuming off of the grid pays that same price in any given hour. Locational marginal pricing means that depending on where on the grid you are putting that energy on, you're supplying that energy, you may get paid a different price. And I think, forgive me, and I left the ISO a few years ago, and I have been out of the industry for a couple of years. And so I'm not in the weeds of all the details of the proposal that the ISO has put forward. But my understanding is that the locational marginal pricing is largely for generators, that loads are still going to pay a uniform price across the province. So I'm going to talk about the supply side more than that. And so generators will get paid a different price based on where they're supplying the energy into the grid. And this is being done in order to manage transmission constraints. So if I take a step back and explain transmission constraints a little bit, if there's a big demand for electricity in Calgary, but we don't have enough generation in Calgary, and there's more generation available near Edmonton, you need transmission lines between Edmonton and Calgary that can move the power from where it's produced in the Edmonton area to where it's consumed in the Calgary area. If there isn't enough room on those lines, there isn't enough capacity on the transmission system, you've got a transmission constraint where you can't get the power to where it needs to be. And so the idea of locational marginal pricing is to incent generators to build their generators as they're developing their projects, to build them in areas where the power is closer to where the power is needed and have less need to use the transmission system to move that power. And the theory is that it then requires less additions to the transmission system to move the power to where it needs to be. And so you save money by not having to build new transmission infrastructure or have to build less new transmission infrastructure.
Yeah, it's almost like people built all the wind turbines in the same place where it's really windy, and as a result, it's all very congested in one part of the grid. And
right. And if you look historically at our electricity system, in like the supply of electricity in Alberta, it was always stuff got built where the resource was that they were using to make the electricity. So all of the coal-fired power plants were close to Edmonton because that's where the coal was. And all of the hydro plants are in the mountains because that's where the rivers were. And all of the wind is in the south because that's where the wind is. So over time, that's how our electricity system has developed. It's a little bit less resource-driven now because solar can kind of go anywhere as long as it's sunny, and which still is sort of the southern half of the province primarily, but and natural gas plants, we have natural gas access in almost every part of the province. And so they have far more ability to be flexible in terms of where they build than a coal plant did, for example. And so that's the idea, is as our grid is growing, because it's growing fast, right? Because of the electrification of industry and the increasing use of electricity, our grid is growing at an incredible rate. And so as new generators are getting built, they're moving towards a market design that will provide more incentives around where that generation gets built, because what price you will get paid will depend on where you are.
So speaking of the emerging and increasing demands on the grid and increase in projects across the board, could you tell us a little bit about the interconnection queue and how that process works? You know, I've seen that there's something like 21 gigawatts worth of projects in the most recent round, and you know that's more than the entire capacity of the grid, right? What's going on there? Can you explain sort of how to think about that?
Sure. And you know, I will say, for as long as I have been connected to this industry, the connection queue has been a big topic of discussion. So in some ways, it's not new. Here's where the challenge is. So for anything that is going to connect directly to the transmission grid, so that's utility scale generation and large industrial consumers of electricity, right? So this isn't about a new house being built down the street from you. This is about stuff that connects directly to the transmission grid. For the AESO to allow something to connect to the grid, the AESO has to make sure that you know, plugging that extra thing into the grid isn't going to change the dynamics of the grid in such a way that it's no longer reliable and no longer resilient. And so there's a lot of engineering studies and things that go into making sure that anything that is connecting to the grid is doing so in a reliable way. And that may mean that there's the project proponent, the developer of whatever it is that's connecting to the grid, may have to pay to add some transmission type facilities that are being added just to support their project, or they may have to contribute to the costs of some things if it's being added to support a number of projects. There's a whole process involved with getting all of those studies done to get to the point of being able to actually build and connect to the grid. And that process can be quite lengthy. And so what project proponents do is they make sure that they get their project into the AESO queue as soon as they can, right? So that it's visible to the AESO's thinking about it as it's doing its studies. And one of the challenges the AESO has always had is that not every project in that queue will actually get built, right? Sometimes they're just tire kickers. Sometimes they're very intent on getting the project built, but they don't get their financing, or they don't get, like, lots of things can happen. They don't get a regulatory approval. There's a variety of reasons why a project might not go ahead. Doesn't want to pick and choose which projects do we think have a better chance of being successful or not. And so it really struggled for a long time and put in place a whole bunch of things to sort of have these milestones that projects had to meet to demonstrate that they were actually moving forward and not stalled out, and lots of things to try to help narrow that pipeline. Like, if you think about someone who does sales for a living and they talk about a pipeline, right? It's a big funnel, and you have all these projects at the top, but the ones that actually come all the way through to fruition is a much smaller group. But when you're looking at the top, you don't know which projects those are going to be. One of the things the ISO did not long before I retired was they introduced this concept of cluster studies, where instead of studying each project individually, when they had a group of projects in a similar area on sort of a similar timeline, they could cluster things together and they could study them together, which is time saving, right? You're not having to study every permutation with every single individual project. And so they've done a lot of, I think, really creative things to try to keep this moving. For years, I have heard people say, well, but there's 15,000 or 20,000 megawatts in the connection queue. How is the grid going to support those 20,000 megawatts? Well, in my experience, those 20,000 megawatts don't ever all actually come to fruition. The challenge is that's on the ISO is figuring out which ones will. And the biggest challenge, the ISO in effect to some degree has a forecasting problem in the sense that most of those industrial projects, whether they be power plants or data centers or manufacturing plants or a steel mill, they can be built faster than a transmission line can be planned and built, right? The regulatory processes are faster. They typically are located in one location, so they're dealing with one municipality and one regulator. When you're dealing with linear infrastructure, and I see this in the rail world as well, you're dealing with lots of landowners, lots of municipalities. So building transmission lines takes a really long time. And so the ISO has to forecast and plan for what do we think is going to be happening in 8 to 10 years' time, in order to start building those things, getting the regulatory approvals and going through the process of getting those things built today. So there's a natural mismatch there that makes that connection queue even more complex. And the ISO would like nothing better than to be able to say to people, it's a quick, easy process, less than 6 months, you'll be able to have your connection and away you go. But the fact is that it actually just at this point in time isn't possible.
That's really helpful. And it's helpful to hear that this isn't necessarily a new phenomenon. This has always been a thing. There's always been sort of, a gradient of projects on the scale of sort of speculative to non-speculative. And on one hand, you have the ISO that's, following the imperative of reliability and planning and trying to be prudent about what and where to build. And on the other hand, you have proponents that are taking a portfolio approach to projects and trying to find a way to marry those two is where you get, I guess, this cluster or cohort-based system, the guac payment, the SASR. Could you actually speak a little bit to some of those mechanisms like the guac payment and what that is and what it's trying to accomplish?
Traditionally, in the last number of years, the way that, from an economics standpoint, the way that our system works, the consumers of electricity pay for the transmission grid. And the idea behind that was sort of in the world of market design, was having as pure a possible pricing signal for energy being put onto the grid. And so there were no transmission costs embedded in it. Guac was the exception to that. So guac is a generating unit owner's contribution to the transmission system. So it was a payment that generators made to contribute to the costs of the transmission system at the time that they're building their generator. And one of the things, we were talking about LMP earlier, one of the things that you can use to send that signal about where you locate is, it used to be that guac was a fairly standard calculation and payment for all generators, but it's another tool that you can use to send a pricing signal at the time that somebody is choosing where to build their next power plant, that you pay more if you're building in a constrained area of the system, and you could pay less, or maybe pay nothing if you're connecting in an area where they really need generation, because it relieves a constraint the other way. Right? So it's another tool in the toolbox in terms of how generation owners contribute to paying for the costs of the grid, that can be used to help minimize how much you have to spend on the grid by sending them the right pricing signal.
So we talked a bit about emerging demands on the grid, the connection queue, and how real that number of 21 gigawatts is. And I think related to all of this is the discussion around data centers, and specifically, whether it's data centers or really any other project, people ask the question of, well, why do you have to even connect to the grid? Right? Why can't you just have your own power plant beside the data center? And you used the term earlier, behind the fence. Is that a new concept, behind the fence? Can you tell us a little bit more about this whole dynamic of data centers? And why can't you just not connect to the grid?
Well, the short answer is you can, but that means you have to be not connected to the grid at all. From a reliability perspective, in a digital economy, data centers can't afford downtime. And so if they're going to have their own generation, they effectively, if they were going to go it alone and not be connected to the grid at all, they would probably have to have triple the generation they actually needed so that they could always withstand one of their generators going down, right? I spent half of my career working at TransAlta, and TransAlta's got some power plants in Australia in the outback that serve mines, and they are mines that are not connected to the grid. And so they have multiple generators to make sure that they can always be up and running. So that does exist, that whole idea of completely off-grid. I think it would be unfortunate. So first of all, I think for the data centers, it would be very expensive. Second, I think it would be unfortunate that Albertans wouldn't get the potential benefits of having, if they're going to build generation anyhow, of having that generation available to the grid, because there's going to be a lot of the time more generation available there than the data center needs. And so that could be inexpensive supply available to consumers in Alberta. And there's sort of a two-way benefit, right, in terms of reliability for both the data center and the rest of the province. So I think it would be a shame, but it can be done. The analogy to help me wrap my own head around it, I think that this is very similar to the exponential growth that we saw in the oil sands 20 odd years ago, right? Where there was a huge demand in the oil sands. In reality, for steam, what they needed was heat, right? And so here's the parallel. What the data centers need is cooling, right? That's really what most of their electricity need is cooling. We all know our computer gets hot when it runs for a long time, right? And the oil sands had high need for steam, and so they built a lot of on-site, behind-the-fence cogeneration plants in the oil sands. And those cogeneration plants, in order to produce the amount of steam that the oil sands need, typically produce more electricity than they need, right? The electricity is almost the byproduct. They're really trying to get the steam, but it produces electricity and steam together. And so those cogeneration plants behind the fence in the oil sands have actually become a very valuable source of energy to the rest of the province at a relatively low cost for Alberta electricity consumers. It's quite affordable energy. And I think data centers, there's a lot of parallels there where they have a high electricity need, but not always necessarily a constant electricity need. They're going to need more in hot weather and less in cold weather, right? And so I think there are parallels where there may be the ability to, for them to make some money by being suppliers to the grid, and for Albertans to get, again, a quite affordable source of electricity. But they are huge consumers of electricity, and so where they're located matters from a transmission system perspective. How do you serve them reliably? And it will require more generation to be built on the system in order to support loads of that magnitude, whether that's generation that's behind the fence and on site at their data centers, or whether that's other types of generation. There will be a requirement for more generation to support that kind of growth, just like there was a requirement for more generation to support the expansion and growth of the oil sands over the last couple of decades.
If you were a project developer or a regulated utility, anybody that is trying to get things built, is working, is connecting to the grid in some way, is there anything you'd like to tell them from I know you're not at the ISO anymore, but that you wish they understood about the ISO's perspective before they, either come to the ISO with questions or engage in processes?
I would say engage with the ISO early to take the opportunity to learn, especially I think for a lot of project developers, and I'm going to say it's a little bit different if you're building generation plants and you've built lots of generation before in Alberta. They tend to have a pretty good understanding of the role of the ISO, the electricity system, how it all works, because they do it over and over again, right? But I think if you're new to Alberta, or you're building, something that's going to consume electricity, like a data center or a manufacturing plant of some kind, or whatever the case may be, engage early and understand what is happening on the grid today. There are, from the ISO themselves, but also there's tons of consultants out there and all the rest of it that can help them to understand where are the areas that are already constrained. And if you're looking to build here, it's going to take even longer because there's transmission reinforcements that'll be required to enable your project to go. But if you built somewhere different, that might not be the case, and you might be able to go faster, right? So I think it's taking the time to have the dialogue.
I've heard about interties, and it feels like maybe a topic that ties a lot of what we've, no pun intended, a lot of what we've talked about together. Can you just speak a little bit about what that means? What is that concept, and some considerations, some big considerations that go into that?
We've talked a lot about the complexity of the electricity system, and nowhere does that complexity come to bear more than with interties. They seem like just another transmission line. They're not. So an intertie is a connection between two jurisdictions from an electricity perspective, right? And physically, they're not that complicated. It's another transmission line. Where the ISO has to think about interties from a physical perspective is an intertie is another way that power is either delivered into our grid or pulled from our grid. So kind of like energy storage, they're both a supplier and a consumer, right? One of the most important things that a grid operator has to think about every minute of every day is how do we recover from any potential contingencies? So every minute of every day, the ISO's energy management system is running scenarios constantly, like millions of data points every minute, and analyzing what happens if any one element on the electricity system fails. Where do we land? So if that line trips off because it gets struck by lightning, what happens on the rest of the system? If that generating plant fails, if that transformer at that substation fails, every element of the electricity system, if it fails, can the system absorb that failure? Can it withstand that contingency? And if it can't, then it puts a red flag up to the operators, and they have to rejig things on the system so that it can. It's not acceptable to have unsolved contingencies, right? And so one of the contingencies that is always looked at is your single largest contingency from a supply perspective. So if you have, for example, an 800 megawatt generator running, and it's running full out at 800 megawatts, if that trips, you lose 800 megawatts like that. What picks up the slack so that your supply and your demand stay in balance, right? And you have to be able to pick up that slack in milliseconds, or you have a frequency event on your system and you've much bigger problems. And so the ISO actually has rules that allow it to restrict things when they can't withstand a contingency of that size. Most of our generators are actually individual contingencies of under 500 megawatts in the province, because it's two separate turbines, so you don't typically lose both at the same time, those kinds of things, right? The intertie to BC, so Alberta's very minimally interconnected through interties compared to other jurisdictions. We have 3 interties, one to Saskatchewan, one to Montana, one to BC. And the major one is the one to BC. It's the biggest one. And the challenge is if you're importing too much power from BC and that line is fully loaded, if that line, and that line goes through the Rocky Mountains, that line trips off about once a month. If that line trips off, you have to be able to recover from losing the 1,000 megawatts that were flowing on that line. And the Alberta system can't recover that. And so we restrict flows on the interties. And here's an added complexity, the intertie to Montana and the intertie to BC. Montana and BC are both part of the same, of WEC, of the same Western interconnect that Alberta is part of. And so those are what are called synchronous interties. And so the power just flows. Power is like water, it flows the path of least resistance. And the Montana line is quite a bit smaller than the BC line. But the way that physics works is if the BC line trips, the first thing that the system will try to do is flow everything that was flowing on the BC line on the Montana line instead. But the Montana line is only a third of the size of the BC line. And so it's actually designed that if the BC line trips off, the Montana line does too. Because otherwise you'd overload the Montana line and again, create cascading problems. And so there's all kinds of, because of that physical restriction, and then the Saskatchewan line is a different physical restriction because we're not synchronous with Saskatchewan, and so it's an HD, it's a DC connection. It's not an AC connection. Back to the, a little AC-DC conversation. And so it can be controlled so you don't have that same issue where it will automatically react to frequency deviations on the system. Because it's a DC system, it doesn't do that. So it can't support the BC line tripping off. So that's sort of the physical challenge of interties. That's the engineering and the physics of it all. And now layer in politics and market concerns. So BC is centrally controlled by BC Hydro. So it's not really an open market to trade into. Same with Sask Power on the other side, right? And so you also get stakeholders in Alberta, generators in Alberta who have built generation in Alberta to compete in a competitive market that say, well, it's not fair if generation that's built under a regulated system that gets to recover all of its costs plus, a return on capital is competing in the same market that we're competing in. That's not fair. And so you get all of these sort of fairness and competition challenges that go on when you connect jurisdictions that have different market structures. And then layer on top of that the politics of no jurisdiction, in our case, Alberta as a province, wants to be so dependent on some other jurisdiction for their reliability. That idea scares politicians, right? That we could have a massive power outage in Alberta that had nothing to do with our system in Alberta. It had everything to do with what was coming in from BC, right? So there's sort of these layers of economics and competition and politics and jurisdictional differences that just make interties this Gordian knot of complexity that are hard to solve for.
Well, that seems like a great place to wrap up because it turns out it's all about complexity when it comes to the grid. And so thanks for joining us, Miranda. This has been a lot of fun. Really appreciate you sharing all these perspectives from such a rich career. And I'm sure there's many more war stories of times when the grid was tested. And so we appreciate you joining. And for those listening, if you're working on complex projects requiring regulatory approvals, regulatory research, organization of applications and accelerating all the workflows, regulatory workflows in between, we are Ultimarii, and we are an intelligence platform that you can utilize to perform all of that work in an accelerated manner. So thanks again for listening to Under Review. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a colleague, and we'll see you next time.